guys, I think this is an interesting topic. Today, it seems like science and atheism is just pushing Christianity out, and it's all just gonna go downhill, and eventually won't exist. We've even seen this with other religions, like nobody worships Greek gods anymore. Nobody worships the Roman gods unless you're crazy, right? But wait, did I just say they're crazy? Like, why am I not crazy? So let's look at this a little further. So guys, if you can see that, I think this is what we think of when we think of Christianity and where it's going. This is where we started in America with our country, and we all went to church. Everybody, just whoop. Everybody's a Christian, oh, and we're just going down from there. Well, it might seem like that, right? We all know that Christianity is probably declining. Less people are going to church now than 20 years ago. But that's not necessarily how it's worked. I would say, and actually research would say, that it's more like this. Now, this isn't a perfect graph, but basically before like the first Great Awakening, we have the lowest points of Christianity in America right there. And so that was like way lower than it even is today, by like church attendance and just stuff like that, people saying that they're Christians. And then we had the Great Awakening, and it really spiked. And so what that looked like was just people were being preached to in fields, and thousands, tens of thousands of people were becoming Christians and choosing to follow God, being baptized. But then we kind of see this drop off. I mean, this is all relative, it's not a perfect graph, but something like that. So what happened? The cycles usually go like this. So we see Christianity spike, and then it kind of starts going down, and then it'll spike again, which I drew in there. Somewhere in there, Second Great Awakening. Wow, what a unique name. But why would... Okay, so I just paused because I wasn't sure what to say next. I started saying, why would God do it this way? And I realized, I don't know. And that's okay, but I'm interested to learn. I've been studying this quite a bit through the Bible. And so let's actually go to the Bible real quick. So this may not be the main book that you've heard if you were in Sunday school or just around Christians sometimes or heard about the Bible. This is the book of Judges. So if you want to look at where that is the, let's see, 7th book of the Bible. So the Bible starts with something called I think it's the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible are kind of like one continuing story. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those 5 books take us from creation, Genesis 1 through 3, to Abraham and his story, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later because that's important for this. And they take us all the way through the death of Moses. So that would be like the 10 plagues and the Israelites getting out of Egypt and them wandering in the desert for 40 years. And so, yeah, that's what those go through. And then Joshua is the next book where they are taking over the land and going back to Abraham. Pretty much God promised Abraham that he would have a great nation, basically, which was more important back then than it was now, just in the culture. But he was promised a son, and he was like 90 years old. And yes, I actually do believe that he and his wife, who was like 100, had a son at that age. It's crazy, but God can do some cool things if you just believe that God is real. It's not so difficult to stretch your mind to believe that he could do that. But basically, Abraham gets that son, and way down the line, his lineage grows from, they enter Egypt with, I think, about 70 people, and they leave Egypt with over 1 million, 2 million people. So even through the 400 years that they were in slavery to Egypt, God was faithful to grow that nation, and then they go out of Egypt and take over the land which Abraham was promised along with the son. So it was important that not only would Abraham have a son and a great multitude of people that came from him, from that son and him, but also that they would have this amazing land that was very fruitful and just great to live in, that God had also promised them. So in Joshua, they take over at least most of that land that they're supposed to be taking over, and they're very faithful. They do a great job of just working at it for like 80 years. Joshua's one of the best leaders that I think we see in the Bible, and he's kind of underrated in my opinion. But after that, Joshua dies, and that's where we pick up in Judges 2:10. And yes, this will connect back. Okay, and also this is kind of weird. We look at these stories from 3,000 years ago, maybe this may have been a little longer than that, and we connect them to our lives today. That's what we do as Christians. And that might sound crazy, but we believe that God actually wrote the Bible. He wrote it through men, but men actually basically wrote what God wanted them to write. And so if God wrote it, it might be a good idea to follow it. Just an idea. Okay, so Judges 2:10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel, which would be like all the things we just talked about, saving them from a million different things. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook, which is forsaken the past tense apparently. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. Talked about that, right? That was pretty important to them, since they were all slaves there for 400 years. But they forgot, apparently, because they weren't slaves, so who cares? Then they followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them, which they were explicitly commanded, don't do that. Try to stay away from all the foreign gods because you will forget. And so that's a big point that God tried to make with them. And then once they did that, they aroused the Lord's anger. And we're going to skip down to verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. And judges are like deliverers, or like kind of leaders, not necessarily like you are guilty judges. So he raised up judges that saved them out of the hands of the raiders, yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Now, were they actually prostituting themselves? That's not exactly what it means. It means it's a symbolism of just going away from God, not following God. And it's like as serious as prostitution to God, and more serious even. So he uses that imagery a lot in the Bible. You'll see that all the time. But let's see. They prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. So, as long as the judge was there, leading them, they were on track. Woo, good job, Israelites. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. So basically they were like, God, this kind of sucks because we got taken over by another nation and we don't like slavery. So then God was like, okay, well, let's get this leader, you guys will get back on track, and then you will not have to be in slavery anymore. So that's what happened. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because that would actually kind of symbolize that decline. It would just mean it kind of went up every once in a while. But that was kind of just a period in Israel's history. Doesn't that sound a little bit like what we were talking about earlier? So basically there is a time where the people are sinning and they're not following God, and then they decide to, or God has a judge, which is interesting. He doesn't just like, the people just don't just start believing. There's actually a leader who makes them, in most people, start to follow God again. And then they follow for that time when they're still being led and being told what to do, right? And then they die and they start fading and fading. And I think that's what we see on this graph right here, right? We don't just see a steady decline, we see kind of peaks. And so maybe I'd suggest to you that we are right now in decline, right? If you've grown up like me in my lifetime, we've been in the decline the whole time, right? But we've only been alive for like 20 years. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what has happened in the past for the last like 300 years. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue on in the future. So if we're going to answer this question, I think that I would say no. Not only is Christianity not necessarily dying and on that steady decline to nothingness in America, I don't believe that, but also Christianity is exploding in so many different parts of the world. It's exploding in Africa and Asia, just parts that it hadn't necessarily reached for a while before. And what did we see? They were in exile, right? That's what the Bible would kind of put it as. They're in bondage. They're in a place where there is no Christianity, right? In China, they don't let them worship Christianity. And the funny thing is that Christianity always kind of tends to do the best when it's being oppressed, which seems kind of weird. But in the Roman Empire, right, that's where Christianity really started, and they were oppressed more than probably any people group on earth is now, besides maybe if you were a Christian living in like ISIS territory or something. But I mean, there were thousands of people who were crucified, like not over 300 years, but like each year, I don't know, they would crucify a lot of people in Rome. But I think it's important to point out, like, either the Christian God existed for all of eternity and still exists today and will exist forever, or he doesn't. And I think I talked a lot about like numbers and how many people are following him, and like that doesn't necessarily matter all that much to if Christianity or God is a real thing. God doesn't need us to follow him, but I think as more of a cultural thing, it's important to know. But I just wanted to throw that in there because God doesn't necessarily need us to follow him. I just thought it might be important before we start answering more questions about God to see, is this actually relevant, and is this all just going to go away in a few years and we're not even going to worry about God or Christianity anymore. So yeah, guys, that's the first video. If you liked this, don't even worry about liking it. Leave me a comment and hopefully a question that you might have. That would be the coolest thing for me, is to get to answer your question and have more content for a possible video. So leave a question in the comments and hopefully I'll be back soon.